So, life is full of questions, isn't it? Life is full of questions. We have them all the time. Some of them are mundane, like what am I going to have for dinner? It's not really that important. Some of them are the sources of unresolved tension and arguments, like is he ever going to empty the bins? Are the dustmen ever going to come? Is January ever going to end? Because it's only the 12th. It feels like it's been going on for weeks to me. But then there are other questions as well that are bigger and deeper. Things like this. What will make me happy? Thanks, Ali. What is the point of life? What should I do with my life? What should I look for in a partner? Should I even look for one? And whether we realize it or not, we do try to find answers for all of those questions. Sometimes we do it consciously. We try and work out what we should do. Sometimes we do it less consciously. Sometimes we answer questions by following our hearts. Sometimes we mull things over. Sometimes we just go with whatever feels right or by talking to people. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at some of those big questions of life. For the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at 5 different questions, and we're going to try and find out of these questions of life answers for our souls, answers that we can put into practice, that will help us and guide us through every stage of life. And to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to be following something which Christians used to do in centuries past and in previous generations. We're going to base our answers off something called a catechism. That's a very exciting word. This was something Christians used to do to disciple one another, where they would ask a question and an answer would just pop out of the person who they'd asked the question of, because it had been drilled into them. So you would hear the question and your brain would just go, bang, that's the answer. A bit like children today learn times tables. So if I was to ask you, let's do a little, should we do this? 6 7s, 5 9s, or 7 8s, that's always the tricky one. So yeah, it was just there, wasn't it? It was just there at your fingertips. This thing here, this is a statue called the Dippy-Lon head. Lawns, when was that made? 590. So I know that from when Lorna did A-level classics and I helped her revise. Dippy-Lon head was made in 590. I know nothing else about it. I just know that's what it was. We have all of these things in our minds, some things that we just know. I can look at that photo and say that was made in 590 BC. And I look clever by doing that, but I literally know nothing more about it. And that's what a catechism did. But it did it with the gospel and its implications. It put the answers at the fingertips of people so that when they heard the question, it was like, bang, that is the answer. And it then helped people as they walked through life to work out what they should do. And so we're going to look at various questions over the next few weeks. And the first one is this one. What is our hope in life and death? What is our hope in life and death? And the answer that people would have learned in centuries past would have gone something like this. I've kind of made it a bit more easy for us to digest. It would have gone something like this. That through God's grace alone, through the death of his Son, we are forgiven and brought into his family. We belong to him. And for people in history, they would have heard that question, bang. That would have been the answer that they came out with. It would have been like watching the Karate Kid being told to, wax on, wax off, or paint the fence. It would have just been instinctive. They would have heard, what is our hope in life and death? And they would have said those words. So we're going to practice this. They would have, let's do that again. Let's try that again, because that didn't work at all, did it? So they would have heard the question, what is our hope in life and death? And they would have said, through God's grace alone, through the death of his Son, we are forgiven and brought into his family. We belong to him. So yeah, that's what they would have done. Yes, and that would have sat there shaping their life and shaping their decisions. When they went through stuff, that would have bubbled to the surface. When they were in a moment where they thought, I've got no hope, that would have come into their minds. And this morning, we're going to immerse ourselves a little bit in those words. We're going to explore a little bit how that truly should be our hope in life and death, what Christ has done for us, how it should make the difference to how we live in the here and now. And so a little while ago, Eric read for us from the book of Romans, that passage where I've highlighted the vegetables bit. I really shouldn't have done that. But we're going to take notice of the last bit of what he read, where he said these things, where Paul is essentially talking to Christians and he's saying, yeah, people have got different ways of working things out about special days and what foods they eat. Actually, don't worry about what they do. You just concentrate on yourself and God. And then he would said at the end these words to kind of sum up what he was saying. For none of us lives for ourselves alone. None of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. And the point he was making is this, that as Christians, something is true. Something is true that we should base our life upon. Something is true that we should base all of our decisions upon. And it's those last words, we belong to the Lord. In other places, it puts it in different kind of language, like we are a kingdom of priests, or we are a holy people, or a treasured possession. But the point is still the same. If you're someone who follows Jesus Christ, those words are true. You belong to God, and the purpose of your life and all that you do is to bring glory to him. And so what we're going to do is this morning, we're going to boil that kind of answer that we looked at earlier down to two things: a motivation to guide us and a principle to live by. And the motivation, like I say, is God's grace has saved us. God has been lavish. He has vastly overpaid for us through the death of his son, and we should seek to live for him. We're going to come back to the motivation in a bit first, but now we're going to look a little bit about what we should do. If we're people who belong to God, what difference should that make to us? And again, if we were to try and sum up what we should do and how it should impact our lives, it's essentially this: none of us are to live an autonomous life. We're not to live as if we are in charge of the things that we do. We are under new management. We're to run everything through the grid of God's grace and his mercy. There are to be no areas of our lives where we say, I control this bit. God doesn't get in here. I control this bit. That little phrase in Romans, I'm guessing that's made some of us in the room feel a little bit uncomfortable. We belong to the Lord. But it's not a one-off. It's not a one-off. It wasn't Paul on a bad day. This whole theme that we should live for God is all through the Bible. So in 2 Corinthians 5, when Paul is again writing about the future and the possibility of being with God or staying on earth, he says these words: whether we are alive or dead, we make it our goal to please him. His goal in life, above everything else, was to please God in absolutely everything. In Galatians 2, he said these words. He said, I have been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Now the life that I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Again, he's saying, I live for God. In the book of Corinthians, one of the Corinthians, I've forgotten which one, when talking about how we should use our bodies, he says these words: you were not your own, you were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. He's talking primarily there to people who are messing around sexually, and he's saying, no, don't do that. You were bought at a price. You don't belong to yourself. So this whole kind of subject about belonging to God, I think it's difficult for us to hear. Because when we read things like bought at a price and belong to God, we think, hang on a minute, that doesn't quite gel with our culture. We like to be free. We like to value self-determination. We like to be in charge of what we do. We like to make our choices about life and career and relationships and so on. If someone was to say to you tomorrow, you belong to me, we would probably say, no. That sounds like control and coercion. And I bet somewhere behind this there's someone who loves money or power or something like that. If we start to think, I am property, we don't like that thought. We instinctively pull back from it. I want to encourage you with God not to do that, not to pull back from this thought, but to press into it. A man named Abraham Kuyper said this: "There is not a square inch in all the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine." There's not one bit of your life that doesn't fall under Christ being in control. And once we recognize that, once we come to grips with that's what God says, we're then left with a question that we have to grapple with. If I do what God says in every area of my life, how do I know whether it'll be for my best or not? How do I know? How do I know? How do I know whether I will perhaps miss out on something good or miss out on my best life? And that's the question that we all have when we start to think about, okay, I've got to follow God in everything. Am I going to miss out? But it's really just the ancient question that human beings have always grappled with. Can we trust that God has our best interests at heart? When he says, don't do this, and when he says, do that, how do we know that's for our best? Is he a control freak? Or is he just wanting us to be in the place where we thrive? As a culture, as people, I don't think we like boundaries. I don't think we do. Who likes the speed limits on the road? Not really. We want to go a little bit faster than them, don't we? We don't like rules. But someone has said this, and I think it's true. Life is all about boundaries, and it's finding the boundaries where you thrive. What you've got to do in life is find the boundaries where you thrive. So think for a moment of a whale swimming gloriously through the ocean. Pretty much safe from predators because it's the biggest thing in the water. It's able to pop up to the north and see the northern lights if it fancies. It's able to go to tropical waters and enjoy the heat. It's able to eat whatever it fancies. It has absolute freedom in the ocean. Absolute freedom. But does it have absolute freedom? No. Whales have, I'm guessing, one rule, and it's this. When the water gets shallower, don't keep going. When the water gets shallower, don't keep going. Don't try and get out onto the land. There's nothing good for you on the land. That's going to be the rule that whales live by. And if a whale teenager is talking to its mother as she outlines these rules to him, and he said to her, I'll do whatever I fancy, you're limiting my choices. I need the freedom to go up onto the beach. The answer they're going to get back is, no. That's not where we as whales thrive. That's not the best place for us to be. We step outside the boundary of the ocean and we die. We eventually suffocate. And it's the same with us. A life where we thrive, our best life, is all about finding the boundaries in which we're going to thrive. And I think at its most basic level, we can accept that. We can accept that, yeah, God has got plans and he's got rules about how we should live. We can accept that God can put the fences there. But we aren't whales, are we? We know sometimes when we cross a boundary, we're not going to end up beached on the shoreline. We're not going to suffocate to death. And we have voices all around us which say to us, I've gone past the boundaries God set, and it was okay. They're all around us. But is it the best way to live? I know I've shared this before, but a few years ago, I was struck by a TED talk entitled Inside the Mind of a Master Procrastinator. Shared this a few times. I found it when I was supposed to be doing something else, which was quite ironic. And as part of this video, the man who put this together, he talks about something called the dark playground. And it's something that every procrastinator knows a lot about, where they, in doing things that are fun, in times and places where those fun things shouldn't happen. So that's the dark playground, when you're supposed to be doing something else, but you're doing something which you think is fun. It's things like, what does he say? I always get it wrong. So things like this, opening the fridge to see if there's anything new in there since 10 minutes ago. That's something procrastinators do. Fantasizing about the completed version of the thing you're working on. I mean, that's something us procrastinators do all the time. We think about, when this is finished, this is what it's going to be like whilst we do something else. And the point that he's making is this, is when we do fun things outside of the boundaries, long term they aren't fun. So the person who procrastinates on the work that they should be doing eventually ends up full of regret about the roads they didn't take and the things that they didn't do. And that's what happens with the choices we make when we step outside of what God says we should do. Eventually, it leads to regret. Might not do in the instant that you do it, but it does lead to regret. And this is perhaps what some of us might need to grapple with. Where do we know in life where we have stepped outside of what God says we should be doing? If you were to look at your life, are there places where you can say, that's where I step out. That's where I don't do what God says. That's the dark playground. That's the whale trying to sneak its way up onto the beach, and it won't lead to you thriving. It might be fun, but it won't lead to you thriving. There's a verse in Hebrews where it talks about Moses, and it talks about the choice he made to be identified with his people, and it says he decided not to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. The Bible's very clear that sin is at times very, very enjoyable. And it says Moses didn't want that. He wanted to be where God wanted him to be. So the question for each of us at this point is this: what do I enjoy outside of what God says I should be doing? And that question touches every area of life. It touches your job. It touches your relationships. It touches your secrets. It touches what you do with your time. These things, if we can think of anything, are not going to lead us and those we love to a place of thriving. And we might need to reframe our lives to be under God again. God knows the oceans of blessing that you need to swim in, and he wants to encourage you to get back to them. So, that's what we should do. That's the principle we should live by. Let's go back to the motivation. Because if what I've said so far is that God knows where we should live, and he sets the rules for us, and that's where we thrive, how do we know that? How do we know we're really going to thrive? How do we know we're going to have our best life? And the answer to that is it's actually a bit of a leap of faith. It's an educated leap of faith. There's a motivation that should encourage us to want to live for God. And I mentioned it a little bit a while ago, it was kind of this. God has saved us by grace. God has saved us by costly, lavish grace. The motivation is that, and out of gratitude, we want to please him. That comes out of that question, what is our hope in life and death? That through God's grace alone, through the death of his Son, we are forgiven and brought into his family forever, and we belong to him. The motivation for living for God is found there. It's found there. And that's what we're going to explore for just a couple of minutes. So the motivation for doing what God says you should do when you don't want to is in places like 1 John 4, verse 10. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. That's a verse worth swimming around in for a while. What that says to us is this. When you and I did not love God, he loved us. When you at your very best were indifferent to God. He moved because he loved you. And his love is demonstrated in this. He sends his son for you. And let's think about that for a minute. God the Father sends his son for you. Who's his son to him? Who's his son? It's Jesus, yes, but much more than that. God the Father had loved God the Son for all of eternity. All eternity past, all eternity future. The Father delights in the Son. He's his greatest treasure, his most treasured possession. The relationships inside the kind of Godhead, the Trinity, we can't fathom them, but they're perfect and they have depths and wonders that we can't even begin to get an inkling on. And God sends his Son as a sacrifice so that all of his righteous anger for the things that we do wrong falls on him, so we never have to face it. And we were at best indifferent to God when he did that. When Jesus dies on the cross, the experience of joy that he had from his Father from all eternity past was broken for a moment, and he couldn't sense it. For a moment on the cross, all of my wrongdoing was on him, and he was a ransom in my place. And if you're a Christian, that's true for you. That's grace. And you know what? When I think of what God has paid for me, I'm not worth it. I'm not worth it. He's paid for a Porsche, and he's got a push bike. He's given his greatest treasure to purchase me and make me part of his family, and I don't deserve a single second of it. And so I now belong to him in the way a child belongs to its family. So when you think about your life and are you going to live for God, it's not about control. He's not out to control you. He wants to place you in a position where you thrive. This is the extent he will go to have you. You can trust that if you do what he says, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. So let's go back to that question of life. Where do you step outside where you know what God says you should do? Where in your life is there a sin that you tolerate, or a secret, or a compromise? Where do you do things where you know that's not what God wants me to do? Look at the cross and trust him and follow him. If nothing is coming to mind, ask God to reveal to you if there is something there. Ask him to help you do what you need to do to get the whale off the beach or stop playing around in the dark playground. Ask him to help you. Help will always come if you ask him those kind of questions. So this morning, as we kind of wrap this up, let's go back to the question, what is our hope in life and death? What is our hope in life and death? It's this, that through God's grace alone, through the death of his Son, we are forgiven and brought into his family. We belong to him. And when this settles in your heart, your life can change. But so can your life as you approach your end. Because if God has given his Son for you, as you approach your own death one day, you can approach it with hope. Because he's given his Son for you. He's going to carry you through it and he's going to take you to himself. What perhaps some of us need to do is this, is we simply need to trust God today. As many of you know, and I've shared it before, I am not a comfortable passenger on a plane. Not a comfortable passenger on a plane. The only moment I like about the flying experience is when the wheels touch the ground again. The rest of it is just terror from the takeoff to the flying, every part of it. When I'm in the air, I'm always thinking, how am I ever going to get my life back? How am I ever going to get it back? And to get it back, I just have to trust the pilot. I have to trust the pilot with the takeoff and with the flying and with the landing. I have to trust him for every course correction, for every little change in altitude and speed. If I was to pop into the cockpit halfway through and say, you know what, I think we should go this way, it would not end well. We have to do that with our lives. We have to trust Jesus, not just for the end of the story, but for the flight as well, for the flight. If you can trust Jesus to land the plane with your death, that's a bad metaphor, isn't it? You can trust him with the whole flight, can't you? You can trust him with the whole flight. You can trust that he knows the boundaries within which you thrive. So what is our hope in life and death? That through God's grace alone, through the death of his Son, we're forgiven, we're brought into his family, and we belong to him. Let that shape your week this week. And next Sunday, we've got another question to look at. We're going to sing. So do stand and let's sing a song, which was almost, you can tell that it was written with this kind of ancient catechism in mind, because it's got the question, what is our hope in life and death? And it's Christ alone. Let's stand, let's sing.